This year, 2025, marks the 50th anniversary of the fall of Saigon. Netflix is offering a 5-part documentary series titled Turning Point, The Vietnam War, directed by Brian Knappenberger. The series includes never-before-seen footage of the war from the CBS archives. Also included in the documentary are interviews with participants in the war, both from the North and the South. One of the most frequent voices heard during the series is Columbia University professor Lien-Hang Nguyen. Born in Vietnam in 1974, she is the youngest of 9 children and was brought to the United States by her parents in 1975. Lien-Hang Nguyen, why did you participate in the Netflix documentary Turning Point, the Vietnam War?
One of the things that struck me 50 years since the end of the war in Vietnam was that there's so much new materials that have come out in the archives, new publications, new books, that, it was really an opportunity to reflect back upon the past 50 years. And I thought that Turning Point just came at the right time. They had the right approach to putting together a documentary. One of the ones that I've used prior to Turning Point, which is extremely effective, was Ken Burns' Lynn Novick's the Vietnam War documentary from PBS. And while they really achieved a lot in terms of promoting our understanding and our awareness of the history of that war, I thought Turning Point is a great companion to that documentary that came out in 2016. Turning Point had the benefit of really collecting from multiple perspectives, non-American, that have come out basically in the past 10 years. So I felt like it was, upon the 50th anniversary, a great occasion to reflect back upon our understanding and the state of our knowledge of the history of that war.
It's a 5-episode series, over 5 hours long, and it's new to Netflix in the last couple of weeks. And you were introduced to me through that when I watched. I said, I would love to talk to the professor about her books and her own personal experience. There were a lot of previous Viet Cong members or National Liberation Front members, and a lot of Vietnamese from the North that were in the documentary. You did the same thing in your book, Hanoi's War. Explain that book and what was your approach to it?
It's a great question about, in terms of getting the perspectives that really have been the most difficult to tap into and to really bring to the fore are the communist perspectives, be they from the North or from the South. And that really was a product of the evolution of the historiography within Vietnam regarding the anti-American struggle for national liberation, for reunification and national salvation. I'm sorry. That's the proper term of how that war is referred to in country today. And so, that has always driven, I think, documentarians as well as historians to get to those perspectives. And so for my book, for Hanoi's War, when I set out back in the 1990s, it was really to understand how the North Vietnamese, working with their allies in the South, so how the communist leadership really was able to defeat the United States of America. So for me, growing up in the United States after 1975, a lot of the conversations around dinner tables at the time and what I learned at school was about how did the United States lose that war. No one really asked the flip side of that question, which was how did the Vietnamese communists defeat the United States and how did they do that and manage to win the war? So that drove the questions that I asked. And while they are related, they're very different questions. And so I set out to really understand the war leadership in Hanoi, and in particular, the grand strategy of the Politburo of the Vietnam Workers' Party. And so that drove the questions that I had in terms of how did they conceive of their war? How did they hatch their strategy, both military, political, diplomatic, to defeat the United States? And so, and then, of course, how did the war evolve on their side? So those were really the main questions I had for my book, In Hanoi's War. The problem, of course, was that the state of the archives, of the materials, of the primary sources that could best answer those questions were closed off to researchers. So the archives were closed. But one of the great things that the documentary of Turning Point took advantage of is that there are now historical actors who are able to really discuss their experiences. Unfortunately, we've lost so many of that generation to be able to answer questions at the highest level. But I think one of the things that Turning Point did extremely well was to really get to the experiences of these revolutionaries on the ground.
If you would have asked me before, and I'm much older than you are, but if you'd asked me before I read your book, give me two names from the Vietnam War that made the big difference, I would say Ho Chi Minh and General Zepp. And once I read your book, those two don't get it. Explain that.
Oh, I love this question. That drove me when I first started doing research when I was a PhD student at Yale. I was following Ho Chi Minh and General Vong Nguyen Giap because, again, if you're reading the books in the United States growing up, reading the histories of that war, those are the two names most closely associated with Hanoi's War. And so I did that when I first arrived in country in the mid 90s. Picking up all the memoirs, biographies, paper trail that I could in the archives. And what I found was that the materials about them didn't answer the questions I had about who really ran the show in Hanoi. How did they maintain the war effort? How did they build up the sort of support within, the governing bodies, within the Vietnam Workers' Party, as well as amongst the citizenry? And the questions weren't answered if I followed President Ho and General Giap. Instead, it was really two other men whose names kept appearing in the materials, and that is Lê Duan and Lê Đức Thọ. Lê Duan was at that time the longest serving now we call General Secretary. At that time, it was First Secretary. So really the leader of the Communist Party, and his closest deputy, Lê Đức Thọ, who was in charge of basically all party affairs until he took over pretty much the diplomatic struggle of the war from 68 onwards, and really went head to head against Henry Kissinger at the Paris negotiations. But we knew so little about them because they weren't the two names that kept appearing in Western history books. But they really were the two who, according to my research, I found that they devised the strategy, they implemented them. They were really the ones who called the shots in Hanoi.
Go back to the first gentleman you mentioned. I picked up that his name was Les Moines.
Yes.
Is that
you have a northern accent, right? That's right.
Yeah. Well, his son is in the documentary.
Yes.
Did you have a chance to meet him?
I think we crossed paths. I haven't had the honor to speak to him. I hope I do. I was fascinated by his interviews. So yes, this is something that, again, Brian Knappenberger and team who did Turning Point, really kudos to them. They were able to get, particularly those who are still alive, some of these great interviews that have, up to this point, not really been represented in the documentaries regarding that war.
Lê Đức Thọ, the only person to refuse the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yes. And
Henry Kissinger was given at the same time. He accepted it, but I think he then gave it back, or he didn't keep it. But why were they given that Peace Prize, and why did he turn it down?
So 1973, one of the things that really struck me in terms of studying the negotiations that resulted in the agreement that ended American military intervention, and that's called the Paris Agreement on Ending the War and Restoring the Peace. I say that's a lofty title. It never lived up to its lofty title. It neither ended the war nor restored the peace. And I think, particularly for Lê Đức Thọ, he knew that. and it was not in keeping with the Nobel Prize to accept. I think one of the things that was quite clear upon the signing of that agreement in late January of 1973 was that it was, according to one of my close colleagues, the Jabberwocky piece. It wasn't really, sort of negotiated in good faith. It was something that in many ways, particularly for the Southern parties, both the Republic of Vietnam as well as the Provisional Revolutionary Government of South Vietnam, so Hanoi's allies, knew that it didn't represent really what Southern voices or really, sort of put the southern half of Vietnam, so the country below the 17th parallel, in a position that they could really come to a diplomatic compromise. So everyone knew the minute that they signed the agreement that before the ink would dry, that the two parties would be fighting again. So I think in many ways that drove the recipients to be like, this was not an honor that they truly wanted to accept, because it was a fallacy. It was something that they're not going to be able to achieve. And I think that drove particularly Lê Đức Thọ. I don't know about Henry Kissinger. So again, it was a situation in which the war would be ended militarily on the ground and not diplomatically at the negotiating table.
Did you ever try to interview Kissinger? Had you ever met him?
I did. So he worked quite closely with my advisors at Yale in setting what is called the Grand Strategy program at Yale University. And so I met him on several occasions there. And he, I think one of the great things about Henry Kissinger was that he was able to really, he's a scholar first and foremost, so wrote really his interpretation and his version of history, particularly his part in it. And so I did speak to him about the war. And one of the great stories I like to share was that when I met him, and I think it was back in 2013, and it was upon, again, another one of these anniversaries, and we were at the State Department, and I was with the Vietnamese delegation, and he walked straight up to him, and I think he assumed I was part of this Hanoi delegation, and he said that, but he knew I was speaking English, and he said, please tell your colleagues that the reason my hair is gray is because I had to negotiate with Lê Đức Thọ. So he was the only man that was able to age me this much. And it was a great moment, which really showed the extent of reconciliation between these two former enemies. And my colleagues, and I will call them my colleagues because they were other military historians from Hanoi, loved that anecdote or that joke that Henry Kissinger told them, and they had this great conversation about the Paris negotiations and really, sort of what unfolded at the time. So unfortunately, Lê Đức Thọ was not there, but a lot of folks who worked closely with him, his deputies, during this period was, and I think it was a nice sort of, again, anniversary in reflecting back about how difficult those negotiations were, even if it ended up not producing an agreement that fulfilled its promise and spirit. Decades later, it was something that allowed Henry Kissinger to approach them and to discuss. So that was a nice moment to witness.
Mr. Kissinger died at age 100 in 2023.
Yes.
I want to ask you some background questions on your own life. Born in 1974, came to the United States in 75. How did you get here?
It's such a, it's one of these extraordinary stories that my parents didn't tell me until I was invited to do the National Book Festival back in 2012 when Hanoi's War first came out. And I decided, instead of talking, I did, of course, talk about the book, but I also wanted to talk about our refugee story. And so I asked them more questions about that time in late April of 1975. And we, very similar to the other 100,000 plus who fled Vietnam, South Vietnam, during those final days of the Republic of Vietnam, had these stories where it could have gone either way. We could have really been stuck back. We could have not survived that journey to eventually to the United States of America, which is where we eventually resettled. But we did make it, and it was through both sort of just sheer luck. We were in the right place at the right time, secured a spot on an oil transport boat to an ammunitions barge that was later picked up by maritime vessels that were put on alert by the United States of America to pick up any refugees in late April, early May. And that's how we eventually made it to the United States. And what I say to my students is we actually did the reverse of American territorial acquisition across the Pacific. So the stepping stones across the Pacific to China, we did it backwards. So we went from basically Subic Bay, so from the Philippines all the way to Hawaii, to eventually to mainland. So along the way went to Guam and Midway. So it was really about this sort of journey in reverse of how the United States and how Americans got to Asia. We did it in a backwards route in 1975. So we'd spent so much. I mean, I was talking to my parents around that time around the national book festivals, but we stayed in no less than 4 different refugee camps across the Pacific and within military posts across the United States of America. We ended up in Harrisburg, right outside Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania, which is where Carlisle Barracks is located.
How long did you live there?
I think all told we were in refugee camps for about 6 months before we were sponsored by a Methodist church in Delaware County, Pennsylvania.
For all 11
For all
of you?
of us. And this was, I'm the youngest of 9. And our group consisted of of 9 brothers and sisters and myself, as well as my parents, some maternal relatives and paternal relatives. So I think about 15 of us.
I have, I'm not going to put you through it, but every one of your siblings' name begin with an H.
Yes.
Why?
Yes, it does. So I think my parents were quite they were fond of the letter H, and they wanted us to all have H. Our names start with H, and again, I'm the youngest. My eldest brother is 15 years older than me, and here they are. So it's Hom Hai Hương Hiệp Hưng Han Hieng Ha Hang. So that's me at the very end. And, one of the things that I remember growing up in Springfield, Pennsylvania, is that I have 2 brothers, and they're spelled Hung, but they're pronounced very differently with accents and diacritic marks in Vietnamese. So one is Hom, and the other is Hung. But of course, it's just Hung. So that was always a difficult thing growing up and answering phone calls and someone asking for Hung. And I'd be like, but which one? Which brother? But they mean very different things in Vietnamese. And it was great, actually, in terms of just, the 1980s, while they were very difficult years, particularly at in the aftermath of that war, to be a reminder of a war that the United States lost. Our community really pulled together, and just like when we saw, and then I think most recently refugees from Afghanistan, the Americans really sort of rallied and helped a lot of we refugees who came over in 1975.
Are your parents alive?
My mom just passed this year, but my father's still alive. We're heading to Vietnam in several weeks. And one of the things that, I'm very proud of the both of them was that they really raised me to remember that while we have a very painful past, that there was what they considered, a civil war, a decades-long civil war that really set the tone for their adult lives and really defined it in many ways, that they supported my efforts to promote reconciliation between Vietnamese today. So they were able to, and still continue to, return to the country of their birth, the one that they fled in 1975, but one that they still consider and do tell their children and grandchildren that we will forever be Vietnamese, even if we aren't current citizens of that country.
When do you first remember having any knowledge of the Vietnam War, or as they used to call it there, the American War?
American War. That's a great question. So there were reunions at Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania. And I remember very early on in the 80s making the old RVN flag, the Republic of Vietnam flag, which is yellow with 3 red stripes. And so for that reunion, we made several of these flags to circulate to the other, folks who were at that refugee camp and spent their first several days and months in the United States of America. So I was quite young. I think this was in middle school. So this was right in the 1980s. So those were my first memories of hearing about this war that very much was such a large part of my parents' lives, and ones that they did not want to talk about. Anything that happened before 1975, they said was too painful. They still had relatives that they no longer could see, really correspond with. And so it was something that was always spoken about with a lot of grief and a lot of sorrow. Over the years, that played a very large part in my sort of understanding of history, as well as sort of understanding where I fell in this sort of my positionality and how it was that I became a young person interested in the past. And so that really drove my college years. So I majored in history, and then through that time at the University of Pennsylvania said, you know what, I think I want to pursue this in a sort of academic capacity, and because I love to teach as well, this is something that I wanted to dedicate my life in doing, because this is really something that influenced me, again, growing up and taking a lot of history courses and reading every history book I could find or get my hands on at the library to understand contemporary history. I then at Yale went fully invested in trying to understand and excavate more about that war. So that really was what drove me. And I think it was these sort of very, again, early encounters with Vietnam War history or the anti-American struggle history. And then upon every book that I read, realized that there's so many unanswered questions. And so that's why I tackled some of the most difficult ones. I remember speaking to one of my colleagues in graduate school, and he's like, my goodness, you're choosing, sort of if you're able to find the materials that speak most to Hanoi's war, how they devised their strategy, how they implemented it, how they were able to defeat the United States of America, both at the negotiating table in Paris, as well as on the battlefields in South Vietnam. That's the Holy Grail. And so in many ways that, and I love Monty Python. I'm like, well, that's what I'm going to set out to do in graduate school, is to really, again, to find these answers in the archives. And to a certain extent I did, but there's still so many unanswered questions. And that's one of the great things that I love about teaching history, because, again, I impart to my students, there's no such thing as capital T truth. Everything is, your interpretation, and history is a living, breathing thing, and it constantly changes depending on whom we talk to and what we're able to find in the archives. And that is constantly, again, that's an evolving picture. And, we can never truly recreate the past in any case. And so there's just multiple versions of something that happened in the past. So that gave me great freedom and flexibility, and really allowed me to write what was Hanoi's War.
I heard you in another venue say that your parents didn't want you to be a historian. You can correct this. And they wanted you to be a dentist because they had all kinds of other children that had excelled in certain areas. What did the other 8 siblings do, and what are they doing now?
It is such a typical refugee story of, growing up, they just said, okay, well, right now everyone needs to major in, and they chose mechanical engineering. And so they didn't speak to my one sister who, because she, when we came in 75, she started high school. And then eventually when she did go to college at Penn State University, because again, we all went in-state for college, she chose environmental engineering, and they didn't speak to her for a year. So they really, I think what they wanted was for their children to major in something that could immediately, that they could, after 4 years, go out and find a job. So they were very hands-on, typical, again, refugee parents in terms of picking out the major for their children. And so for me, by the time they got to me, again, I started kindergarten in the United States. So they're like, okay, well, let's look at what we have. We have a PhD in physics, in molecular biology, some engineers. So we have the applied sciences. We already have a surgeon, a lawyer. They're like, what don't we have? A dentist. And I was like, why choose a profession for me that just seems to just, again, no offense to dentists out there, but I would not have had, I did not have the skill set or the ability to really pursue dentistry. So I was always one for the social sciences or the humanistic studies. And again, because I loved the idea of teaching, of doing research, I wanted to be an academic. But my parents, they were concerned because, again, back then, and here I would say even up to the 90s, the early 90s, these were dangerous times. So I think, now Americans know more about the situation in terms of the Vietnamese American community, particularly through Viet-Thanh Nguyen's Pulitzer Prize winning novel called The Sympathizer. But that's actually based on actual events that occurred, that transpired in the 80s and 90s in these large diasporic communities where you did have targeted killings and assassinations of Vietnamese Americans deemed as communist sympathizers by their compatriots. So I'm very interested in potentially writing one day more of a history of a study of what I call the Forever War, or how the Civil War in Vietnam was transported on American soil after 1975. So there was a lot of these sort of tensions ran very high in the Vietnamese American community. So they were afraid that if I wrote something like Hanoi's War, that I would be considered a communist and that my life was in danger. I told them that by that time, I don't think that there, that something like that would transpire, but there were very, very intense fights. I'll say it like that, within my community. And so they were afraid of me being pulled into diasporic politics.
I want to read a statistic in the back in one of your endnotes, and it's a study, and this will all make sense as I start to read it. This study gives the figures for total Vietnamese casualties and devastation as 1.1 million soldiers killed, 600,000 wounded, 300,000 missing in action,
yes,
approximately 2 million civilians killed, 2 million crippled or disabled, 2 million exposed to poisonous chemicals, 7.85 million tons of bombs, and tens of millions of liters of herbicide dropped over the country. And I just got a little bit of extra there to show that 2 million tons of bombs were dropped on Laos during that time. What do those statistics say to you when you first saw them? What do you think?
One of they capture the true extent of how terrible and how deadly and how terrible that war was. I mean, I think even numbers don't capture it, and they're constantly debated and contested. And even if we all can agree at the end of the day on these statistics, I don't think it captures the brutality of that war. But for certain people, that's the only way to really impress upon them how terrible and how brutal that war was, is to really lay down the statistics. And I think it really and you captured it right there in terms of the tonnage of bombs dropped. There is this sort of not competition, but it's very difficult to really assess which country in mainland Southeast Asia, amongst what was called the former colonies and protectorates of French Indochina, suffered the most in terms of, or can say they were the most heavily bombed country in the history of humankind, in the history of warfare, because it could go to Laos, it could go to Cambodia, it could go to what was formerly referred to as the Republic of Vietnam. But I think in looking and putting all those statistics together, one of the things that really struck me, and I say this in my course on the wars for Indochina, on my course in looking at modern Vietnamese history, is that again, we understand this as a war that the United States lost, and we know the statistic of the amount of American lives that were lost in that war. But it was a profoundly Vietnamese, Cambodian, Laotian war. If you just look at the numbers of those killed, both combatants as well as civilians, of those wounded, it was a profoundly Indo-Chinese experience. But why is it that, again, we know so much more of the American perspectives and the American experiences in that war?
I have to say, one of the things that you have in your book that just, I never heard this before, that General Zapp was in Hungary during the Tet Offensive. That was a tip-off that he wasn't as powerful as I thought he was. He lived to be 103, I believe. But when did you discover that Le Duan was the one behind, or was at the top of the pyramid running the show?
That's a great question. So this was, again, early on when I was following the paper trail in terms of what Ho was doing, what Zapp was doing, that it was really Zapp's life, because he lived for so long after 1975 and after victory and reunification, that if you look at sort of his political career, it really explains the sort of political infighting that took place in Hanoi with regard to that war. Because while he goes down in the tomes, in the sort of the canon of Vietnam War literature, or even military history, I would say, he is so well known that he's constantly cited as one of the most brilliant generals that ever lived, that ever existed. But if you then actually follow and you study his career, again, even after 1975, it would reveal to you that there was a lot more political infighting. And everything comes back to, for me, the Tet Offensive. And again, if I can just shamelessly promote my next book, it's going to be a comprehensive history of the battles of 1968, starting with the Tet Offensive and ending with the third wave of attacks in the late summer, early fall of 1968, is that, what was unfolding at the same time of these battles. Basically what I'm arguing is that the communists tried to win the war outright in 1968, is that there is this, sort of other story out there, which is that, this is really when Lê Duan and Lê Đức Thọ are able to sideline General Zapp in terms of military decision making, and he was basically sent to Hungary, exiled. I argue in my book. I think at the time officially he was seeking medical treatment, but that was really. For those on the inside and who knew, it was because he disagreed with the Tet Offensive strategy. So this was an example in which he lost those arguments, those battles, to Lê Duan and Lê Đức Thọ to put forward what was called the General Offensive, General Uprising strategy that was basically the 1968 attacks. So Zapp was not in agreement. He wanted to build up to the cities and towns, not start there in 1968, and he lost that fight. So there's so much more to the infighting that took place behind closed doors in the party leadership that we're only just starting to understand. And what blew my mind at the time is that it's like if we didn't know the extent of infighting in the Third Reich, or we didn't know basically what was going on in Hirohito's Japan. And to me, that's astounding because, again, there are tens of thousands of books written on the Vietnam War. But at the time that I was doing research, very few talked about the struggles taking place within the party leadership in Hanoi.
What was Lê Duan like?
Lê Duan was a very, he was a leader with convictions, and he knew how to survive in a communist-led country in which he saw his predecessors, he saw the previous first secretaries rise and fall. So I think he was a very adept leader in really being able to build this, what I call basically his infrastructure, his his party leadership upon this sort of solid foundation that basically never was taken down in the time that, in his decades plus party leadership all the way to the 1980s. So, what he was able to do in terms of the way we know that he was able to wage this war that defeated the United States of America was already a huge feat. What he was also able to do was really build the modern Vietnamese communist government that we know of it to today. So he was someone who was a formidable leader and foe to the United States of America. So we're only just starting to really understand what he was able to erect. And really, sort of, if you look at if you look at Vietnam today, a lot of what Vietnam has built is thanks to his leadership.
By the way, what was your father doing during the war?
So my father was part of the Republic of Vietnam Armed Forces. He was a military recruiter, captain in the Air Force. So again, a very typical story of he was a military man in South Vietnam.
What did your mother do during the war?
So she had 9 children. So she at first was a factory hand for Pasteur, a French pharmaceutical company. And then she was a seamstress and worked from home. And really, the two of them raised 9 kids in a war-torn country. So, again, they even when she was alive, she never liked to speak about that time before 1975. I think it was very painful for them, both, during the war, but then also making that decision to leave in 1975 was one in many ways they regretted in the first several years when we were in the United States of America. But, after all 9 kids were put through college, and then just, we had educational opportunities that we would never had we stayed in Vietnam after 1975.
What did your parents do for work once they got here?
Typical immigrant story. They worked night shifts. My father worked for Amtrak, which was a great company. I, still love riding Amtrak because living in the Northeast Corridor. And then my mom worked for the U.S. Post Office.
Do you and your 8 siblings and everybody else in the family ever talk about the Vietnam War?
It's with 9 children, we're so we're very different. I would say I share this passion for history only with one other brother who is he's a history buff. He loves military history. I would say my dad likes to talk history while my mom doesn't. It's not a conversation that comes up that often. I will take them to every, I use the opportunity whenever we have these family gatherings to try to get my siblings who are less interested in history to attend some of my events. And I was, I loved when Turning Point came out because we all have Netflix accounts. And I think they did not make it through the first episode. And again, not the fault of Brian Knappenberger and his team. They did a great job, but I think they have heard me talk about history too often. I've dragged them to my events that they weren't able to sit through the other episodes. But I think we're going to have a watching party, a viewing party in at my house, and I'm going to make all of my siblings watch.
Well, Brian Knappenberger, who I do not know, has done a series of documentaries, not just on Vietnam, and he operates, I believe, out of the West Coast. When were you interviewed for that, and how long ago did that documentary series start to be produced?
I knew of it quite early on that they were putting together this documentary, and I want to say we had done interviews in New York City, where I'm based, because I teach at Columbia, over a year and a half. The time flew by, and I enjoyed every minute of those interviews. There were many more interviews, and probably just, again, footage. I guess now we say the cutting room floor, but it was a great experience. What I love to do is is to talk about the war and force myself to do so in different formats. I teach, again, a year-long course, a semester-long course. One of the things I'm trying to work on is to speak about the war for documentaries like Turning Point. And while I think you appear over several minutes in different episodes, hours go into those interviews. And it was, I loved every interview I did for Turning Point, but there's so many more stories. So I'm again talking now not just to future historians, but future documentary filmmakers, that there's another documentary that could be done on the Vietnam War, because again, new materials will come out, different people to talk to, even generations removed. But as that generation, unfortunately, is passing away, and as they're really sharing their treasure trove of materials, be they diaries, memoirs, family papers, I think this will drive new scholars, new documentarians to really, sort of again grapple with the history of that war, and in ways that we can't agree upon. There are so many arguments that still that scholars debate about, that I think sort of warrants and deserves more books written about and more documentaries to be made about. So I mean, they just did a phenomenal amount of work in trying to, again, find historical actors at the time to really be up to date on the literature and on the historiography.
If I were able to follow you around as you began your research, international research, give me some sense of where you had to go in the archives? How many times did you go to Vietnam? How were you received once you got there? What was the first year you went there? That kind of thing.
So it began in the mid-1990s, and I did research first in the United States of America. This was right around the time that, I think the Nixon materials were still in Washington, D.C., because the Nixon Library had not been built yet, and because the materials from the Nixon estate, it was still tied up in litigation. So as a result, instead of going to the presidential library, most of the scholars who were interested in Nixon materials had to go to the National Archives and Records Administration in College Park, Maryland. So I started out there and then went to the presidential libraries in the United States, including UT Austin for LBJ materials, to Michigan for the Ford archives. And then I went to Vietnam for the first time in terms of doing research, I think in 1997. And again, at that time, they had not allowed, scholars to do research, and this included not just foreign scholars, but also national scholars, to access materials from the Foreign Ministry archives, the party archives, or the military archives. That's still the case today. So you can only access those archives if you are members of if you work for the Foreign Ministry, party, or military. And unfortunately for me, those three archives were the ones that would inform the questions I had, which were all about military strategy, about diplomacy, and about high-level politics on the North Vietnamese side. So I was lucky enough to do research in the Foreign Ministry archives. Now I work quite closely with all of these different bodies within Vietnam. And so the story is a little different in terms of my access to historical materials. In addition to the United States and Vietnam, I did research in Europe. One of the things that, if you want to understand what is happening in the United States of America, is go to the European archives. And for me, the British archives were phenomenal for that. They kept really great tabs of what was going on both in Hanoi and in Washington. So really getting the sort of British perspective was quite interesting. France, of course, hosted the negotiations. So I did research in Paris, both at Aix-en-Provence as well as in the Foreign Ministry archives. I went to Hungary to do research, so tried to get to the materials on the communist side via the East European archives. So I ended up doing a lot of international research. I think, this was, again, pre-pandemic, pre-digitization of a lot of these materials, and I love dealing with actual papers in the same way that I still prefer reading books to reading things online. And so while I do like that materials are a lot more accessible electronically, there's still nothing that beats going to a dusty old archive, opening up these sort of folders and looking at the actual physical papers that exist today.
How many times have you been to Vietnam?
Oh, I never get enough. I go now 4 or 5 times a year.
So, in your research, as you led to writing this book, which was a number of years ago, and you're now doing TET, have you finished that book, by the way, TET?
I am still working on it, and I am going to finish it this summer.
But what I'm starting to ask you is, where did you find, and this could be one or two examples, something that really hit you right between the eyes and said, this is what made the difference in this war?
It's a great question. Before I get to that, I will say that one of the things that we just finished, and unfortunately I'm sitting around looking on my desk and I don't have them, but I was a general editor of the Cambridge History of the Vietnam War. So that just came out a couple months ago, and it includes over 75 chapters written by the foremost experts, and these are international experts on the war. So I have more than 75 authors that I pulled together for this 3-volume Cambridge history. So that's really the flagship study of the war that has just come out. So please check that out for all of you out there. So that just was completed. I'm now focusing so much on the Tet Offensive, and most of the great finds that I was able to basically have in Hanoi's war really drove me to this next book on the Tet Offensive. And one of the most astounding things that I discovered, and this gets to your main question, was, so the Tet Offensive to me was one of the most misunderstood events in the history of the Vietnam War. So was it a huge victory for the Vietnamese communists, or was it their greatest defeat? This is really the event that again, if you're an American, as you say, that really changed America's war. That set out, that was the turning point that really started the end of American military intervention. Well, I'm hoping to really blow apart all of the myths and all of the conventional wisdom that comes with our understanding of the Tet Offensive. I am trying to work out the argument right now in terms of how do we understand 1968 and the battles that unfolded in that pivotal year. I've unearthed answers to questions about why did the Vietnamese communists launch such a spectacular nationwide coordinated series of events, that battles and attacks that took place, that unfolded in the cities and towns across South Vietnam, focused mainly on the coast. Did they actually think that they were going to win the war outright in 1968? So I argue that yes, they were seeking full victory. Their most minimal aim was basically to strike a political and psychological blow to the United States in a pivotal election year. That was something that now we write about, that's their greatest achievement. But I argue that that's not what they had sought to do. So that it was, again, only their tertiary aim. They were hoping to cut the country right in half, the Republic of Vietnam. So that's just, again, I hope that it whets your appetite to read a full history of the 1968 Tet Offensive. But I answered those sorts of questions and really speak to what happens to Ho Chi Minh and General Giap in that year. And what I've unearthed is that they were heavily repressed by their colleagues in the Politburo, that they were exiled to places like Hungary and China. For Ho Chi Minh, this is really the winter of his life, and so he lived out his remaining months and remaining year in exile. So why was that? And for me, it's all about the 1968 battles.
I assume, I was in Hanoi 30 years ago. I assume the Ho Chi Minh area of Hanoi is still there with the museum, with his, he's laid out there, and it's the cleanest place in Hanoi. Is that still the case? And I mean, I know that in 30 years that place has got to have changed tremendously. But do they still honor him as the most important person in Vietnam?
Yes, they do. And you have this open invitation to come with me to Vietnam. So you can see how much the country has grown, but that area in Baden Square is still the way it is. I mean, it's really, Ho. We when I go there, I always say, is Ho still in country? Because he does get sent, in terms of just. He mainly gets sent, I think, to Russia, in terms of keeping the embalming and the preservation still up to date. So sometimes he leaves the country, but most of the time he's in Baden Square, and of course he's still revered. I mean, he really does continue, and his legacy and his leadership still guides the Communist Party to this day, and rightfully so. So I think, so long as the Vietnamese people, and I would say both in country as well as overseas, understands his pivotal role in 20th century history, Vietnamese history as well as global history. I think he will continue to be commemorated and revered in the way that he is.
One personal experience in that trip 30 years ago to Hanoi, walking down the street, people couldn't have been more friendly. This would have been in the early 90s. But the thing that I remember most is people would yell at me, no Russia, no Soviets, no Soviets. And, I don't understand the impact of the Soviets and the Chinese on the North. Can you help us there? How much did they play a role in defeating this country in the war?
Sure. I mean, it still is the case today that that Vietnam is very close to China, Russia, as well as the United States of America. So, those three countries, we're still in this sort of 20th century dynamics of the Cold War, but in the 21st century. So you still have those, three main countries that are very important for Vietnam moving forward. And now we're, getting close to the third decade of the 21st century. So, one of the things that strikes me, like it did you in returning to Vietnam, is that the Vietnamese people really are ready to, even at that time, you going back in the 90s and myself as well, to really promote reconciliation. And so I think that's where you get the, particularly as an American, no Soviet, no China, is that they want to indicate that Vietnam has been ready for reconciliation. And that's why I'm so happy to have seen in my lifetime the United States and Vietnam really reach the highest level of cooperation through the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. So, we're in our 30th year of reconciliation. So, that I think just speaks to really how far we have gone since the end of the war. So at the 50th anniversary, we're able to reflect upon, while that was a devastating war, look how far we've come, two countries, two sets of people, in terms of really grappling with that war's legacies, but being able to move on from that point. That said, again, we are at, if you want to say that it is a 21st century Cold War, the Vietnam still has to maintain close relations with the People's Republic of China as well as Russia. And so this is one of the things that makes the history of the Vietnam War still very relevant and very important, not just for the United States of America, but also for Vietnam. Because, as I like to say in my classes, Vietnam was one of the biggest losers, biggest victims of the 20th century Cold War. I'm hoping that it becomes a pivotal player in terms of maintaining the peace for the 21st century Cold War.
As you know, we were told during the Vietnam War that we were there to make Vietnam free for democracy. They're now a communist country. What's the total population now?
Close to 100 million.
What's it like living now, from your perspective, in a communist country, from what you've learned from the people that when you visit there?
Vietnam is a second home to me. So when I go to Vietnam, I mean it's a communist country. The people are very happy. The government, particularly under the present party leadership, I think has the potential to really become, as I was saying, a very important player on the at the international in the international arena. And we can see this. I mean, Vietnam has the fastest growing economy, the strongest economy in Southeast Asia. It's probably the only country that can really go from a middle income country to a high income country. In the present era, I don't think a country has really been able to achieve that since the 1980s. And so Vietnam will be the first in a while if they're able to really advance their economy. And I think under the present leadership, they will do that. And in many ways, if you speak to Vietnamese in Vietnam today, that they were held back as a result of history. They were held back as a result of the Vietnam War and pretty much the rest of the Cold War of the 20th century. But now that era has closed, it's you can't contain Vietnam or the Vietnamese. And so again, I was blown away because I didn't think I would see that again in my lifetime or in my career, to go from studying the Vietnam War and to studying the legacies when Vietnam's economy was at its nadir in the 1980s to being now one of the strongest and most exciting economies to watch. And then seeing the state of U.S. Vietnam relations, be elevated to the point of this close relationship, and being probably, again, a pivotal player in understanding U.S.-China relations and the 21st century ideological struggle, that Vietnam plays a very important role. I would have never predicted that, but but if anyone who actually studies Vietnamese history, I shouldn't be surprised because again, it was the Vietnamese people were able, particularly on the communist side, to defeat the United States of America. I wonder what they'll do, moving forward. I mean, I think basically sky's the limit.
Back to the documentary series Turning Point, the Vietnam War on Netflix. One of the things that I noticed through the documentary, there were a lot of tears,
yes,
from all sides, the North Vietnamese, the South Vietnamese, and the Americans.
yes.
And I'll just throw one more thing because I got to let you go here, is one of the Americans, and I don't remember who it was, said the following: "We don't believe a word the government says."
Yes, that was, I mean, the Vietnam War, such a significant event, not just in Vietnamese history, American history, but in international history. It also changed the way historians reflect back upon the understanding of the drivers of, say, something like U.S. foreign policy. It's really as a result of the Vietnam War that scholars took a much more critical perspective of our nation's leaders, and how was it that we became involved in an overseas conflict. I think this is the death of the imperial presidency. Of course, we see it on the rise again, but the Vietnam War was, it was a turning point. And so I think, a lot of the voices that come out of Turning Point show that, say, there was what I think it was David Halberstam calls the lying machine, right? So many of our leaders lied to us. One of the things that struck me is that's not just the case for the United States of America and for Americans. I mean, the leaderships in both Saigon and Hanoi lied to their people about why they fought the war, how the war was being fought, and really, I think it's only today that we see, with hindsight, that is something that doesn't just pertain to the United States, but that happened to the Vietnamese people as well, that their leaders were not being entirely honest and not transparent about why that war was being fought, even if it was, again, at the expense of the people.
Okay, last question. Of your eight siblings and your parents, did any of those not go to Vietnam? Or maybe the other way to ask it, have they all been to Vietnam?
They've all been to Vietnam. if I could convince them, I say we spend half the time over there and half the time in the United States, because that really does represent, again, we are Americans true and true. This is our country. We are citizens, but we will always have an affection because, and again, this is something that the General Secretary just said in his speeches leading up to the 50th anniversary of what they call Liberation Day in Vietnam, that Vietnamese blood runs through our veins. And so we will always have this connection to the country of our birth. So it's a lovely way of thinking that, we have the ability to travel to both countries and feel a part of both countries. And so I'm very proud to say that all of my siblings have been back.
The name of the book we've been talking about, and the name of the book is Hanoi's War, which is still available. You can still find it. And you've got a book coming out on TET soon. Plus, we've been talking about the documentary series on Netflix called Turning Point, the Vietnam War. Our guest is Columbia University professor Lien-Hang Nguyen. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Brian.
Thanks for tuning into this week's Booknotes Plus podcast. If you have a moment, please consider rating and reviewing us wherever you listen to podcasts. Your feedback will help others discover the program. And don't forget to share this episode with friends and family. For the latest on new episodes, schedule updates, and more, follow us on X @C-SPAN Radio.